Marc Stiegler, welcome to Behind the Fiction. Thank you so much for being here.
And thank you for inviting me, Steve.
It is always a pleasure to chat with you. You are the author of one of my favorite LMBPN series, and that is the Braintrust series. And I have to say that there isn't a week that goes by when I don't have a thought in my head about transitioning this or that to the Braintrust, because I've read them, I've listened to them on audio, and it's real. In my mind, it's a real thing, and I want it to be a real thing. And so I think about these things that could be transitioned to the Braintrust. Can you give listeners who might not be familiar with the Braintrust sort of, what is it?
Okay, well, so the founding event that separates our universe from the near future of the Braintrust universe is that the American president initiates deportation phase 2, in which he expels all of the immigrants in the United States, and notably he drops the 101st Airborne into Silicon Valley to expel all those foreign engineers. So the Valley companies see this coming, so they anchor a fleet of cruise liners off the coast of San Francisco in international waters, and all the foreign engineers move out there. If you want to have a meeting between the American members of your programming team and your foreign members of your programming team, you just take a helicopter or a ferry out to the Braintrust and you hold the meeting there. So as a consequence, this place where we're getting these 1%ers in terms of engineering and scientific excellence, this becomes the place where the top 1% in engineering and science come from all over the world. And so eventually it comes to be known as the Braintrust. And that is where these stories all take place.
All right. And it's not just, well, they are the top of the top in terms of brain power, but they don't come from privileged backgrounds in a lot of cases. They're just people who just happen to have really good thinking processes.
So in book 1, it focuses on things at the very first Braintrust archipelago, and most of them are from, like Google or Facebook, although the primary character actually comes from Bali. But as the books go forward, they send additional fleets of Braintrust ships here and there, and they are it's described by one of the characters as being like a mining undertaking, where they're sending people out into the backwaters of the most impoverished places in the world, where there are very, very smart people, but they have no hope of ever going to college. Many of them would not necessarily even learn to read and write, but we test them. They have an educational system and a testing system called Excel. So you can take the Excel test on a cell phone, and if you pass the Excel test on the cell phone, then someone will come out and do a more thorough engagement with you, decide whether you're the right kind of person, whether you've got the kind of grit, the integrity, and the smarts to become a member of the Braintrust community. And then they'll bring you on board. Basically, they'll give you a scholarship for getting through college and becoming a Braintrust engineer.
So is this the kind of place where you would like to have spent your formative years? Because you spent a lot of years working in Silicon Valley yourself.
It certainly the Braintrust has its attractions. I think that, if you read the book and you read about how the Excel educational system works, I think you would find that it's designed basically it enables every person to self-actualize as much as they can, as fast as they can, to be the very best they can be as soon as they can be it. And we actually have it. It turned out when I wrote the first book where I describe Excel, one of our beta readers, Jim Kaplan, actually did research in educational and testing systems. He's got a doctorate in behavioral psychology or something along those lines. And so he gave me rafts of very useful criticism on how to make the Excel educational system really sing. Okay, so it's a really good idea. So it's fiction reflecting what real life should be.
I like that. So one of the things that I enjoy in your books is you always give credit to the people who have helped you with ideas like you just mentioned with Dr. Kaplan, and there are others that as you go through your research for the things that could be, and you are a dogged researcher. I get the sense that you are. Um,
I was
you
an HP lab research scientist for a time,
okay,
so it
all
comes with the
right.
territory.
But you like to give credit for that, which is great. But in I mean, there's different types of science fiction. In some types of science fiction, it's hey, we're making stuff up and we're shooting ray guns and people are exploding and it's great fun. And there are others where you read through it and you go, could this possibly actually happen? And in some cases, some of the stuff that you described is in the works or is happening. And you kind of walk through some of that. And I feel like I'm getting smarter when I read your books.
That's excellent. Thank you. My favorite of the first of all, this is true hard science fiction where all the science is real. So in that sense, it's like reading Isaac Asimov. One of the main ways I learned about molecular biology was by reading Isaac Asimov's original Fantastic Voyage. Do not confuse that with the movie. The original Fantastic Voyage, okay, it was full of real, actual facts about biology. My favorite example of an invented technology for these books now is what is the cryptocurrency smart coin, which plays a very prominent role in the last book, which we just published, Braintrust Requiem. And in this book, basically the world goes into a global economic collapse, and the smart coin algorithm, it's a cryptocurrency, the algorithm is designed to flatten the boom bust cycle, okay? And this flattening of the boom bust cycle, I worked with 5 economists and 2 cryptocurrency software engineers to design a currency that would in the real world flatten the boom bust cycle and get us out of this awful mess that Keynes first described back in the 30s. In any event, so yeah, that's an example of something that does not exist yet, but could and would solve a very significant problem in today's world.
All right. Now, and when you talk about things like that, the complexity of things like that, people might be thinking to themselves, wow, this is going to be a lot of work to read these books. And it's not. First off, it's really fun. But you have clipped out some like one-line teasers that we're going to be building quote graphics for. And I think that will give listeners a real sense of the writing, the humor. Why don't you read a few of those and kind of we'll talk through where the ideas for those lines came from.
Okay, very good. So these are teaser lines. The idea is to give you a flavor for what it's like to read the book without giving away any of the plot. And so we'll start out with a quote from one of the characters in the book, which on the one hand, what's being said here is so self-evident that it's surprising that that anybody ever even has to say it. But here it is, and it is, every girl should have her own supersonic fighter plane.
All right. So who says that?
Okay, well, so for those who have read the earlier books, I think it's pretty obvious. This is said by Ping, who is the itty bitty ninja who specializes in having the bigger gun.
Yes, and she is absolutely fearless with the use of technology and things that fly. It's like whatever, yeah, it'll be fine.
Yes, that's right. So anyway, so that's her. The second one, which gives you an idea of the more serious side of the story, is do it, starve the city. Okay. And this one is actually from a flashback scene that flashes back to a moment in the late the final climax of Ode to Defiance, the book that precedes this, which is about the world pandemic that precedes the world economic collapse.
Yes, and
Okay.
for those scoring at home, this was published over a year ago.
Yes, that is correct. So in any event, so that is from that one. Um, this was a scene that I had wanted to put into Ode to Defiance, but Ode to Defiance was already too large. And I tried to not do this scene at all, but it's a fun scene in its own way, even though we're talking about starving the city. And it's a poignant scene. And a very important thing happens during this scene that that I had to go through it anyway, and so I do it as a flashback. Okay, so the next one is only a couple dozen are still alive, and wouldn't you know, one of them had to be a lawyer.
I love that one. I don't know if Judith is going to like that one, but I love that one.
I fear that the fate of the lawyer in this particular example is less than desirable, but there you have it. One more. Well, well, technically, he's not my lover yet. I suppose I should tell him before I move in with him. So.
All right. So now I'm curious who that was, and you may not want to give that away.
Yeah, in fact, I am not going to give that one away. This is a character that you have met, but she was a bit player, very minor character, but she really steps into the limelight in the fifth book. The fifth book, you know, it really is the finale of the series. It wraps up subplots dating all the way back to the very first book. And this is one of the subplots that I set up in the very first book with two casual toss-off lines. And you see this character in every one of the books, but you never pay any attention to her. She's part of the background.
Okay. All right. Interesting. And you talk about all the different threads that have weaved their way through the series, and you mentioned the toss-off lines in the first book. Was it your plan to actually use those lines for this purpose in a later book? And if so, did you know how far away that book would be? Did you know it would be book 5, or did you think it would be book 3?
Okay, first of all, Lynn has the best description of the Braintrust series that I've heard yet, which is that it's a 5-book trilogy.
That should be one of the quote graphics that we use.
Yes, I started out writing one book, but by the time I'd gotten halfway through the first book, I realized that there was more to this universe. You know, I built this entire world, and by the time I was halfway through the first book, I could see a series of additional plots. And so it was at that point that I started looking at some of these things that I was creating and knowing that that they would show up later books, some of them in the very finale. There's a subplot that starts with a terrorist burning the lock off of a hatch in one of the Braintrust books. He burns it off using a strip of magnesium. And that is the beginning of a subplot which comes to fruition in the great final climactic battle in book 5. And at that particular moment, when it comes to fruition in book 5, Colin Wheeler, one of the main characters, breaks down in such a fit of laughter in spite of the fact that there are 50 precision-guided munitions hurtling towards his ship. he breaks down in such laughter that he has to sit down for a moment before he can go back to the control board.
All right. So a little history for you. You were traditionally published with Bain Publishing, a hardcore science fiction line.
Yeah.
And then there was a lengthy break while you were working in Silicon Valley doing stuff that really smart people do. And then you did something that really smart people don't do. Decided to go back and write more books.
Yeah, yeah. I was a well, so you know, I've had a fairly varied career. I was a Fortune 500 executive at the beginning of the 90s. I then became basically a dot-com startup guy. Uh, I was a turnaround specialist. If you had a startup company, this was in the dot-com boom. If you had a startup company and your 20-man programming team had spent $10 billion and 3 years working on this thing, and they still did not have a schedule for when they would have a product. Okay, at that point, you call me in, and I organize it. And that, you know, the description I just gave you was a description of one of the actual companies that I did a turnaround on. So anyway, so I did that, and then I was able to do a little bit of writing still while I was doing that, believe it or not. But eventually, I wound up, you know, the dot-com boom came and went. I retired for a little while, wrote another book. And then I wound up working for HP Labs. I first came in as a visiting scholar, then I became a research scientist there. And basically, as a research scientist, I used all of my words writing these academic papers. And so I just couldn't write. I couldn't write while I was doing that. So eventually, after I retired, I looked around and I completed a couple of software projects, and then I turned back to writing. So
But this time, as an indie author versus the traditional publishing years ago, and so there's a difference there.
Yes.
And then there's the difference over the course of the 20 years or so while you were off doing other things. And what was the biggest shock to you with the new world of publishing as opposed to what it had been before?
Well, I don't know if this was the biggest shock, but certainly one of the funniest shocks was certain ways in which I am now engaged with the process and the people in the doing of the book. You know, back in the 90s, under traditional publication, I would write a manuscript. I would turn it in to Jim Bain. He would send it back. He would send me the galley proof. I would fix, you know, some of the more glaring one sentence problems, and then I would send it back, and I wouldn't see anything or hear anything until the book came out, and I'm looking at the cover and saying, that's an interesting cover. He wants one of my books. He put this, the cover has this picture of this gigantic flying battleship cruising over the battlefield. Well, there is a battlefield in the book, and there is a vehicle in the air over that battlefield. But now this was back in '89, okay, and the vehicle that I described, that is the real vehicle in the book, in the story it's called a Sky Hunter. Today it is called a Predator. Okay, right. So basically it's this very lightweight drone, goes very slow, very large wings, hunting the battlefield for command and control headquarters to blow up. And so that was, which is very much the mission of the Predator today. But in any event, so that was one of the vehicles that I invented for David Sling. Well, anyway, so now on the cover, where they have this frail little predator-like drone, on the cover, it's this gigantic flying battleship. So, uh, so in any event, in today's world, one of the most amusing things is, first of all, you know, we've been doing Audible versions of all of the Braintrust books, and we got this really delightful narrator who is a Catherine McEwen, who is breaking into the world of acting in Hollywood, and then she does Audible books on the side. And anyway, so the Brain Trust, right? There are people from all over the world, and so they all speak with different accents. English is the language that everybody speaks on the Brain Trust, but they all speak it with all these different accents. And she does all the accents. She's marvelous.
She's magical. She is so good with this series.
Yes. Well, so in any event, so every time we do the Audible version of a book, what happens is first she'll read the book to see what it is she's narrating. And when she gets done, there's always a number of terms that I have used. I mean, this is hard science fiction, right? So there's always a number of terms that I've used that she will come back to me and say, so how do I pronounce that? Okay. And so what I do to answer this is I go through her list of words and I record the correct pronunciation, and then I send that to her, right? So this is all entirely new, you know, in comparison with TradPub. First of all, doing an Audible version at all was very rare in those days. Second of all, interacting directly with the narrator, having her ask me questions about things. Oh, she does corrections for the book too. I have sentences that are spoken by characters who are explicitly stated to be British. She's from Britain, and so every once in a while she'll come back to me and say, you know, a Brit wouldn't say it this way. This is how a Brit would say it. So she helps me correct the story as well. It's all pretty wonderful, actually.
And I know something that I don't know whether this is something that you're enjoying because you're a research scientist or something that you loathe, but you're throwing yourself into Facebook advertising.
Oh my gosh. Yes, I am. You know, this is way outside my comfort zone. Marketing has always been my failure. I've never been able to promote successfully. But I seem finally, after 3 years of the most frighteningly unsuccessful advertisements in the history of Facebook, I finally seem to have a few advertisements that are reaching the people who will truly enjoy the book and persuading them to go ahead and click through and buy it. It's satisfying seeing that I'm at least a little bit now able to connect with the people who would really enjoy these books if they just knew that they would want to read them.
That's part of the problem with publishing today. It's just there are so many books. It's just finding your audience, and once you find your audience, then they help to promote the books for you.
Yes. So that's the plan.
That's the plan. And there was never a doubt that you would figure this out. It was just a question of when. All right, last question for you. And this is something that I asked your wife, Lynn, when I interviewed her. The last question I asked her is, what was it like to edit your husband's book? So I'll ask you, what's it like to have your wife edit your books?
Yeah. So I partially overheard your conversation with her earlier in the day, although I had left the room for the period of that conversation. Normally, she sits in one couch surrounded by her computer gear. I sit in the other couch surrounded by my computer gear. And every once in a while, as she's editing along through somebody else's book, she'll say, "I need a word." And I'll look up and she'll read me the sentence and I'll say, you know, the word that needs to be replaced is obvious. And so I'll suggest a word and she'll say, "Thank you." And then we'll type along for a while, and then I'll come to this place and I'll say, I need a word. So it actually works pretty well most of the time. Now, when she's editing my books, she is right about one thing, which is that when she starts laughing at something in one of my books, it's very, very hard for me to restrain myself from asking, so what was it that you found so funny that you burst out laughing? Yeah. So my discipline fails sometimes.
Excuse me. She edited your books when you were at Bain as well, right? Or did she not? I know you were published with Bain and she was working at Bain.
Yeah. She edited for Bain. Basically, I introduced her to Jim and Tony, and she said, "Yeah, I'm an avid reader." And she got. I don't remember exactly how she wound up becoming an editor for them, but no, she didn't actually edit my books at Bain.
Okay, so this is a first then.
Yeah. It's much more intense. At Bain, okay, so with a trad pub organization like Bain, you have to turn in a book that is very well done. You can't have it saturated with run-on sentences or sentence fragments, all of that sort of stuff. You can't have something that has just endless consistency failures. If Jim Bain or Tony were to look at that and were to start reading a book like that, they just throw it back to the nominal author. Okay, so the quality of the writing in trad pub coming out of the author's typewriter was extreme by modern standards. Lynn is supplying a new skill, which is she's taking stories that are still a little bit rough and massaging them into works of considerably greater beauty. In those days, we just had a proofreader, right? Just a and one of the things that it was mostly proofreading, and that was as far as it went most of the time.
Okay, and you used a word that some of our listeners may not be familiar with: typewriter.
Oh gosh, yes. Yeah, the good old days.
What was it like back then when you couldn't just backspace 5 times to change a word?
It involved being much more careful. I learned to type when I was 14 years old. I typed, I type at about 80 words a minute. And so you had to be you had to be very careful when you were typing in those days. Now, I was among the first people in the country to get myself an IBM PC desktop so that I could start using a computer to write and edit my stories. And I remember I for $3,000, I bought a 6 megabyte hard disk.
And you probably thought to yourself, I could never fill that up.
6 megabytes is actually hard to fill up when all you're doing is creating ASCII text.
Yes.
Basically, the entire Braintrust series, if converted to pure ASCII text is, well, actually, it would just about fill a 6 megabyte hard disk. Okay, never mind.
There you go. All right, but you mentioned the entire Braintrust series. So coming out simultaneous with this interview is a box set of the entire Braintrust series. So if you have not been reading along, and if you have, then certainly you've read them all already, because if you read the first one, you're going to want to read the second, the third, the fourth, and the fifth. But if you haven't been reading along, this is a great time to get a great deal on this series. And it's incredibly well written. The stories are great. The people who love it, love it. There are people who are put off by the politics because you seem to hate all politics. And
That's right.
it's not just, oh, he doesn't like this side or he doesn't like that side. It's you're mocking everybody
Yes,
in
I'm
this.
making fun of everybody. If you cannot laugh about your personal favorite politician, this is probably not the right series to read. But if you're a little bit mellow, if you know the answer to the question, how do you know a politician is lying? Which is, Steve, his
He's
lips.
moving his mouth. Yep, lips are
Yep,
moving. Yep.
his lips are moving. Okay, so if you understand that, and so you're a little bit mellow about it, then I think you'll just enjoy it.
So it's a great value. And wow, these are the last two books are massive. This is a lot of reading material. You're going to really enjoy this. So, Marc, thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you for sharing your one-liners and your stories. And we wish you the best with the box set.
Yes, thank you.